Welcome everybody. I'm Richard Dennis, the Director of the Australia Institute. If you haven't been to Politics in the Pub before, thanks for coming along. Tonight we have the privilege of hearing from Karen Middleton talking about her book, The Unwinnable War, Australia and Afghanistan. If you didn't already know, Karen is the... Can we get the music there? Karen is the Chief Political Correspondent for SBS Television, where I assume she's just been.
Yeah.
And the author of the new book, The Unwinnable War, which tells the story and the backstory to Australia's military involvement in Afghanistan. She joined SBS in 2005 after 20 years in newspapers and former president of the Parliamentary Press Gallery. As I'm sure you know, she's a regular panellist on the ABC's TV's Insiders, and we often hear her on local ABC radio as well. So again, if you haven't been before, the structure is Karen will talk for... Karen will talk for 20 minutes, half an hour, and then we'll have plenty of time for questions. There are some clipboards that will float around if you haven't been before and you want to put your name down. That's how we keep people posted about who's speaking next. But I can tell you that our next event is the 23rd of November, where we've got the Chief Minister, Katie Gallagher, talking. So without any further ado, I'll hand over to Karen, who hopefully will get a drink shortly. Thank you, Karen.
For my lateness, I was waiting for a cab, and a friend and colleague scooped me up and drove me because I was having trouble. I am encumbered, not from the war, but I actually went to, was chasing the Prime Minister and the US President around Washington in March, and was running for the motorcade and snapped my ligament in my ankle. So I got it back to functional well enough to go to Afghanistan in August, but I had to have surgery recently, so I now have this very attractive boot for another couple of weeks, which means I'm very dependent on taxis and I'm not enjoying the Canberra cab service at all at this point. So if you don't mind, I'm going to sit and hopefully not slip and chat from here, if that's all right. Oh, thank you. Thank you. That's great. Okay. Yep, that's good. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Thank you very much, Richard and the Australia Institute, for inviting me here tonight, and thank you all for coming. It's an amazing turnout. I thought I'd do this in sort of three parts. If in the beginning, as Richard said, I recently published a book. It's called An Unwinnable War, not The Unwinnable War. It's a small distinction, but it's because I often explain to people that the title came from a quote from David Petraeus, the former commander of US forces in Afghanistan, which is in the front of the book, and it talks about this being not the kind of war that you win. He said, this is not the kind of war that we win. I think it's a war we'll fight for generations, and it's a war that our children will be fighting. So it's a comment on the kind of war it is, but it's also a provocative title, but that's why I get picky about it being an unwinnable war. So I thought I'd start just by talking a little bit about why I wrote the book and how I wrote the book, and a bit about what it says. Then I'll talk about my recent trip to Afghanistan with the Defence Force, and then make a few observations of my own about the situation there, and then we can have a chat perhaps. I decided to write this book because nobody else had written one about our engagement in Afghanistan from an Australian point of view, a political point of view. I was looking ahead probably a couple of years ago now at the upcoming 10th anniversary of September 11, and it just really struck me that there was no document that had pulled together the backstory to our commitment in Afghanistan, how we still came to be there 10 years later, and what the political decisions had been that had taken us from then to now. And something that became very clear to me, it was already, but it became even clearer through the course of this research, was that going to war is always a political decision. Going, staying and going home, it's not a military decision, it's a political decision, and so our political leaders are the ones who make that decision. They are informed by military advice, but in the end it's their decision. So it isn't only operational considerations that they factor in, it is also the politics of the time. And that was very clear to me as I researched. So that's why I decided to write the book. Having worked in politics for a long time, I sort of did a mental checklist of the kinds of people I might need to speak to, and realised that I had associations with most of them and probably could get to them. I was very grateful for the cooperation and agreement of a few key people, particularly the now Defence Minister Stephen Smith, the former Prime Minister John Howard and the current Prime Minister Julia Gillard, because with their agreement, a lot of other doors opened, and I was able to get to some people I really needed to speak to for the book. So I did, I think, something like 91 interviews over about and wrote the whole thing over about 7 or 8 months. So it was a pretty quick process in the end. I got stymied a bit at the beginning by the federal election last year and the result, or the non-result. So it was quickly pulled together, and I really started not knowing terribly much. It was a bit of a blank canvas. I had been in Washington with John Howard on September 11, 2001, and that was where my interest began, because I was there and I saw his response to that. I was there when he made the commitment for us to go to war, and I've sort of tracked it ever since. And then I went to Afghanistan in 2007 on a trip with the Defence Force, which was a highly restricted exercise. We were meant to go and sort of have a look but not really talk to anyone. God forbid a soldier should speak with us. So they've changed their attitude, but I had that experience in 2007, and so I started to pull this thing together, and it became a very interesting exercise for me in terms of learning a bit more about how our government works in particular. What struck me about the beginnings of this conflict, and I talk about it in the book, is that this was a war of what I describe as a war of vengeance. It was in response to a particular attack. That wasn't an attack that was about gaining territory, like some conflicts have been, where if there's an invasion, it's designed to take territory. It was an attack on a culture and a way of life, and the response to it was very swift, not very well thought through, in my personal view, and about vengeance, and they would argue also prevention. But because of the way it was a response to an unexpected attack, there hadn't been a lot of strategising about how to do this, and they were also dealing with something that was not terribly common, which was a non-state-based entity. So it wasn't a government that attacked, it was a non-state-based entity. And they set a mission that was twofold: to rout Al-Qaeda, who they held responsible for the attacks, and try to dismantle that network and remove the Taliban from office, because the Taliban in office in Afghanistan were offering succour to Al-Qaeda. And of course they went in and did that. They did half of it, they didn't do all of it. There's obviously debate about whether they should have gone in at all, but they did, and they thought they had routed Al-Qaeda by sending them back across the border into Pakistan. That went well, didn't it? And they did remove the Taliban from office. So I think that very first year, after that very first year, there was a sense in the United States that permeated the Allies that they had achieved their objectives and it was safe to all go home again. I think obviously they only achieved one of those objectives, and we've sort of seen what's happened since, and you could argue that the duration of the war is largely because it was mishandled from the beginning in terms of what the objectives were. Just to go on and talk a little bit about how the thing unfolded. Just got some notes here. Something that's misunderstood, I think, about the very beginning of this conflict. There's a bit of confusion between Iraq and Afghanistan. In the case of Afghanistan, it wasn't that we were dragged into this war. We pushed very much, and when I say we, I mean the government that ruled us, pushed very much for Australia to be involved. At the beginning, the Pentagon in the US didn't actually want allies to help. They were quite happy to do it by themselves. The State Department had a different view and said, no, diplomatically we really should have allies go with us. And the Australian government pushed very hard to be one of those allies. So it was John Howard driving it particularly. He was very personally affected, as most people know, by being on the spot in Washington at the time. And when you talk to him now, he says, I would have done everything exactly the same even if I hadn't been there. I certainly think the government would have committed itself, but I personally think he really drove that, and it was affected by the depth of his feeling from being on the spot. So he dispatched some senior military officers to Florida, where the US Central Command was based and where the war was about to be run out of. And he said to them, go and get us into the war. Go and get us a good spot. Get us a good job. In the book I paint the picture of all these countries descending on this on the car park of the MacDill Air Base in Florida and setting up camp in the car park. So they used demountable buildings, and they were jostling for position, and you get the real sense of the politicking that went on even at that level of trying to be seen to be a good ally, elbowing other countries out of the way to get, you know, a good job that would get you brownie points in the war. And Australia did that very well. So they went in, Special Forces went in 2001, and as I said before, pulled out in 2002 thinking that the job was done. They went off to Iraq, and there was a lot of public debate about that, in contrast with Afghanistan, where there wasn't much, because there was bipartisan support in terms of the major parties for going in. And again, just before we get to Iraq, when you talk to John Howard about that, he acknowledges that he unilaterally committed us to war, not knowing what that would involve, at a news conference on the lawns of the ambassador's residence in Washington on September the 12th, 2001. He acknowledges he did that, and he's not sorry about it. He says, I did it because I think it was justified. Sometimes you need to be preemptive. And he said, I knew I would have the support of the opposition, and I did. And so consequently there wasn't much high-level public debate about that commitment or that decision at the time. I think there was a lot of shock about what had gone on, and this all sort of ensued very quickly. And then with Iraq, it was different. It was seen to be different. I think with the US, from the research I've done, I think there was not only a pre-existing inclination to go into Iraq from some people, particularly at the Pentagon. They've been pushing for that from the first Gulf War, but particularly after September 11. But I think there were a couple of other things that came into play, and one of them was a genuine paranoia on the part of the Americans that they might get attacked again from somewhere else. And it clouded, in my view, the judgment, and it caused them to misinterpret an awful lot of intelligence. And I think in the intelligence community they were stung by having had an intelligence failure the first time, and were absolutely determined that that didn't happen again. So consequently they had an intelligence failure in the wrong direction, and they all went off to Iraq thinking that that was where they had to go to avoid a repeat. We know how that's borne out, and US forces are now pulling out, and our forces are out, other than a security detail at the embassy. But it's been quite a long time coming. In 2005, after Iraq had gone pear-shaped, suddenly they realised that Afghanistan was going pear-shaped as well, and the Americans then called for allies to come back. And it was a little different the second time. They did want support, and they were talking about returning to Afghanistan both in a security sense and to start to do what they call reconstruction. I detail in the book the way that the decision was taken for us to return. There was a lot of pressure from the Americans for us to do that. I spoke to Richard Armitage, who was the Deputy Secretary of State in the Bush administration. He was kind of the Australia guy. He was the one that did a lot of the negotiating, and he said something interesting to me. He said he believed that the first time we went into Afghanistan, we went for Australia's interests, but he felt that when we went back, we went for the US. Now, John Howard disagrees with that, and so do a lot of his former members of Cabinet, but I thought it was an interesting observation, and it says something about the nature of the US alliance, and I'll come back to that later. But at the time, Robert Hill was the Defence Minister, and he liked the idea of getting involved in reconstruction. He felt that Australia had a moral obligation, having been in there in the beginning, to help to try and rebuild the country, and they developed this thing they call counterinsurgency, which was involving trying to use economic development as part of a military strategy to boost the country and empower the people. But they'd come to it fairly late, and that was what they were starting to engage in now. Reconstruction, building projects, development projects to get the local people on side is a basic version of that. And it also relies on governance structures that it's a point of some debate whether they had enough of a history of those structures to make this strategy work at all, but that's what they chose to do. Robert Hill thought it was a good idea, took a submission into the National Security Committee for Reconstruction, and got ambushed by John Howard and Alexander Downer, who had taken a different view. And this is something that gives you a bit of an insight into the way the government ran. On security matters, it was very much a two-man government. Downer and Howard made a lot of these decisions themselves, and then took it to the National Security Committee and got it endorsed. And that was the case here. So Robert Hill went in proposing reconstruction, came out again with an instruction to send SAS back, because they said, if we're going in, we want to be in doing the hard work, doing at the sharp end, is the way they describe it. And I will say to you now, They were always happy to be engaged in the hard military work using special forces, but they never wanted to be involved in anything messy.